Hello everyone, welcome back. You're watching Avorion episode 6. I'm Enigmius, and today it's all new. Except for that big square in the middle, that big cube in the middle. That's the same one that's been there this whole time. If you saw the last episode, you saw that we had a bit of an unplanned shakedown. We took the ship out for a little bit of a spin, and it didn't take long before we had drawn attention that we just really weren't in a position to respond to. The ship was ultimately destroyed. I don't know if you noticed it towards the very end, but we ended up back in our little drone, and then the drone was destroyed, and we ended up respawned in our drone near a station. The station came under attack, and as I kind of watched it, I realized that it wasn't able to defend itself at all. It's just a bizarre set of events. In fact, as we build this, you may notice off in the distance tracer fire and explosions, because that little event set off apparently World War III in space. I noticed when I placed the turrets onto the ship in the last episode, the music changed. And I think that has some significance. There may have been some events that were triggered by adding turrets to our very first ship. And I'm just hopeful that as we continue to work on this guy, that nothing creeps up on us and decides to make it impossible to continue working over here. That having been said, I looked at the ship as it was progressing after the last episode. We were able to reload it, and there were certain things about it that I liked, and there were certain things about it that I didn't like. One of the things that I didn't like is that it was very long, and the scale was just off. So we had these things happening along the sides that were in line with what I had in mind, but they just didn't work. I looked at them and I thought, I'm not really happy with that. And the whole process of looking at it and not really being happy with it was triggered by the fact that we got demolished, and it didn't seem like we were anywhere close to being able to do anything to prevent it. So I decided that we would take what we learned from the first attempt at the Spirit build and see if we can't hammer out everything, adjusted, refined, reflecting the things that we learned the first time through as quickly as we possibly can, so that we can carry on, make some progress, get this thing done. And at the very least, the goal for this ship really was not to be taking it around and picking fights with it. It was to go around and mine for a while and gather some resources and apply those resources towards the next build. That's the whole sort of purpose of this ship. It has weapons on it, 2 double Gatling turrets or whatever they are, for defense, so that we aren't defenseless sitting out in open space. But we learned that we very much are defenseless sitting out in open space. I don't know if it was the things that were attacking us had much longer range than we do, but I never really felt like we were putting up much of a fight. So there's a few design things, design goals or design ideas that are going to be a little bit different with this particular iteration. Again, taking what we learned from the last one. The top is going to be more flat to make it more conducive to putting that glass fixture on top. That's going to be something that we can incorporate from the very beginning. The sides as well are going to be more flat. And what I plan on doing is, by the end of this episode, you'll be able to see what it's going to look like in its most basic form. And then rather than trying to implement these details on the side panels of the ship as part of the build, we can add them after the fact and not have an especially difficult time of doing so, because we're going to make it very, very easy to add on to the sides of the ship without having to overhaul what we've already done. So that's going to be one of the goals, is basically by leaving things as flat as possible and then coming back afterwards and adding the details. I think it's going to be a lot more viable, would be one word that I would use, but also a lot easier to come back after and add details that elevate the build from a very simple sort of set of profiles to something that's a little bit more elaborate, a little bit more interesting. So that's a slightly different approach that I'm taking this time around, in the hopes of pushing things a little bit closer to what I had originally had in mind. You might notice also that in this case, I've incorporated something that resembles a bumper into the design from the very beginning. And to be completely honest, I'm not 100% sold on it. I think whether or not it works is going to depend a lot on what's happening on the rest of the ship. I think if we get some bold lines and some really interesting things happening, then that bumper will just sort of accentuate everything and reinforce the whole muscle car sort of theme. If the rest of the ship is kind of dull and lackluster, I think that bumper is just going to look out of place. I mentioned a couple of episodes ago that feeling that there's a not so fine line between a muscle car and a Studebaker, and we kind of want to avoid making our muscle car look like a Studebaker. Maybe sometimes a little bit easier said than done. So I'm getting a feel for the size of the blocks that I'm working with and kind of managing particular curves with different size blocks, and also considering what I'm doing in a larger context with the blocks around me instead of focusing in on one particular area, because that's sort of what makes the whole thing come together a lot easier when you have everything is sort of pre-planned to fit together, as opposed to individual isolated elements and hoping that they come together in a way that's going to work, because what we've learned is that quite frequently they won't come together on their own. They need a little bit of help in the planning stages in order to make that happen. So I don't think it's really going to take all that long to finish this one off. It's going to be probably 20% shorter front to back than the previous ship, which is kind of in line with what I think is a little bit more to scale with what I'd originally hoped to have. We're in that little stage now where I've talked about in the past, where we've got this fairly abrupt curve, but we don't want to make it look too angular, so we're using little wee tiny blocks and incrementing the angle on those blocks as we work our way around. And it's just a little bit time consuming, but it's not necessarily difficult. Every once in a while I'll look at this and it's sped up. It's 4 times the normal playback speed, and it feels like it's taking forever, but it's really not that bad. I noticed, you can see we're zooming in and I'm looking very closely, we had a little bit of an overhang, and I wasn't, it wasn't what I wanted at this stage of the game. We're too early in to the remake to have that kind of overhang that basically indicates there was an issue with the planning, there was an issue with the execution, something didn't go quite the way it ought to have gone. And I decided just to stop and sort of fix it before I moved on, so that we don't get into that situation where we've got a lot of issues, things that we either have to fix or have to be unhappy with, creeping up on us over time. Once we actually got down to the business of smoothing that out and getting it sort of fixed, so to speak, I'm pretty happy with the way it came around that corner. I mean, like I say, it was a fairly abrupt angle working its way around, and I'm satisfied with it. The profile, when I look at it, nothing stands out as being less than the standard that I would have set for myself. And now it's just a matter of figuring out how we want this, basically the very sides of the top of the ship and the way that they bend down and go all the way around to the sides themselves is sort of what I'm looking at now, and trying to make sure that the blocks that I select are not only suited to what we're trying to accomplish, but also keeping in the back of my mind, these are the blocks that we're going to be working with when we're placing the details onto the side. So if we make them too thick, or if we make the angles too great, it's going to make it so that we can't add the things that we want without having to remove a bunch of stuff and make a bunch of changes. We can if we have to, but if we know ahead of time that we have an opportunity to avoid that, it makes sense that we would take the steps necessary to avoid that. Overall, I think our little escapade with whoever it was that shot us out of the sky, ended up being a net positive because it gave me sort of that impetus to take a look at things and make the necessary adjustments before we got too far into a build that I was already starting to feel was maybe lagging a little bit behind in the execution. The difference between what I had in my head and what I was getting in the game was getting larger and larger as time went on. At this point, I'm still working with these little wee tiny blocks coming around the side. This is where I have to make the decision, and this is something that I have absolutely no feeling of mastery about at this point. We had these little wee narrow blocks that we're using to come around the corner, and then we have a couple of different options. We can continue using those little wee narrow blocks and continuing them all the way back, which can be kind of problematic later on because we start using larger blocks in the larger sections where the shape is more uniform, like all the way down the side. This preliminary pass, there's not going to be a huge variance in the angle, so we're going to be using larger blocks, flat blocks. If we leave them all, the ones that we've already placed, as little wee narrow strips, when we go to use the match feature to speed things up and to line things up properly, it becomes more difficult because we need those little narrow strips to be not so narrow. It doesn't really work so well with the match function. The other alternative is to take all of those blocks and merge them together, which is a very sensible thing to do, but I'm always a little bit concerned then that we've changed the way everything is fitting together. So we've had this uniform set of blocks coming around the corner, and then all of a sudden we take a bunch of them and we change them to a single block. If we want to do anything now with that detailed area, we're not going to be able to use the match feature because we've turned all of the little narrow blocks into the larger one. It's this weird sort of decision. It's the only way I can think of to describe it. It's a decision that has to be made that sort of determines whether or not we're committed to moving in a particular direction, we're done with a certain area, and now we can leave those requirements behind, or trying to preserve everything so that we've got the ultimate flexibility. We can do whatever we want, adjusting whatever we want, and have everything sort of line up. It's a little bit weird, but I think ultimately, if I'm a little bit careful about how I approach the design, it's probably going to end up in the long term being better just to merge them. Once I realize that we're done navigating a particular corner or something, we don't need those super fine little blocks anymore, we can switch the adjacent blocks to the larger versions just to make everything else that much easier. If I'm looking at things properly, I think that might be just the way forward in general with ship design, is to start with a relatively basic hull and then add details and, you know, aesthetic structural elements after the fact to make everything kind of come a little bit closer to what a person has in mind for the design. That to me ultimately seems like the best way to approach this, as opposed to trying to do everything all at once and ending up with something that we're not ultimately all that happy with. So this part here where I'm working is actually, it's very difficult to see just at a glance, which is good. That's kind of the point. But it's those outer edges along the top, and they're sloping up a little bit as they move towards the back of the ship. And the whole idea behind that is just a very subtle element that we can build in from the very beginning that gives a certain look to the overall design of the ship. We could have gone either way. We could have done flat all the way across and then added this sloped element after the fact. That would have been one option. But in this case, it's such a minor detail, despite its significance a little bit later, that I decided to just go with it from the very beginning and see where we end up. It's another one of those things where if we decide for whatever that approach isn't working, we can always pull it apart and come up with something a little bit different. But ultimately, it took us about an hour to do what previously took us 5 hours. So we're in good shape in terms of the learning curve and kind of getting more comfortable with what we're doing. In the next episode, be a flashback, a little deja vu. We're going to finish off the back end, the top. We'll start working on the details on the sides. We'll see how long it takes us to get that done. I don't expect it's going to take a huge amount of time, but it's also one of those things, having decided that we're going to do it towards the end, I don't want to rush it, because we don't have to rush it. We can take as much time as we need to do it the way that we want it. So that's what we're going to do. So if you want to be notified about the next episode, the easiest way to do that is to subscribe to my channel or follow me on social media. Links for social media are always in the information section below the video. Feel free to leave your comments and feedback. Thanks for watching, guys, and take care.